Do you want to talk about the fly from Prince Harry's book Spare? And did you know he was once a spy? Let's get into it. Harry references these three courtiers when he has that summit at Sandringham with his mother, his father, and his brother. This is what he says about the fly. Quote, "The fly had spent much of his career adjacent to, and indeed drawn to, shit. The offal of government and media, the wormy entrails. He loved it, grew fat on it, rubbed his hands in glee over it, though he pretended otherwise. He strove to give off an air of casualness, of being above the fray, coolly efficient and ever helpful." And who is the fly? It is Simon Case, the former secretary of Prince William. This man has lived, y'all. This is a lengthy piece from Politico EU about Simon Case and his rise to power. He's super fascinated with the Cold War, especially the intelligence techniques. He formerly worked for one of the government communications headquarters known as GCHQ, which is one of the UK's central intelligence agencies. Simon is also involved in Brexit, and I think this line is very interesting. Robbins was also suspicious that Case was briefing journalists on the talks, despite a clear edict from Number 10 that all developments must remain under wraps. It's not the last time that Case is accused of leaking to the press. Quote, "Suspicions were raised in Johnson's Downing Street when a profile of the PM's then-girlfriend and later wife Carrie appeared in the high society magazine Tatler." So Case goes from Brexit to becoming the private secretary for Prince William. A former colleague said he took the job because he's fascinated with how the British state works, and it's a rare opportunity to work with someone so close to the crown. Simon worked for the prince from 2018 to summer of 2020 when he returned to work for Boris Johnson. He was appointed by Johnson, who was then the prime minister, to become a cabinet secretary and head of the Home Civil Service, which made him the youngest cabinet secretary to date. Some alleged quotes from people who have worked with Simon. "I like Simon, but he's a snake," said a senior Tory who worked closely with Case during the Johnson era. "He was never going to be the one to tell Boris how it is." Quote, a former special advisor added, "He's like a heat-seeking missile in that he seeks out where the power lies and toadies to it." He was also referred to as spineless by non-political staffers in Whitehall. He seems like a curious choice to be the private secretary to a prince, until you consider the fact that his ability to operate in the shadows, gather information, leak information to the right places, would be seen as an asset in the environment that we're starting to see take shape that has existed within the comms team in the British royal family. He's also in a little bit of controversy as of recent, but he's also apparently very good at getting out of jams, so I would anticipate that we'll see Case land on his feet once again. So that is a little bit about the fly, Simon Case, Prince William's former private secretary. Let's get into who the bee is from Prince Harry's book Spare. The bee is Harry's code name for the late Queen Elizabeth's private secretary, Sir Edward Young. Here's what Harry has to say about the bee. Quote, "The bee was oval-faced and fuzzy and tended to glide around with great equanimity and poise as if he was boon to all living things. He was so poised that people didn't fear him. Big mistake, sometimes their last mistake." Interesting. Sir Edward Young was born in October of 1966. He worked for the international side of the Barclays Bank between 1985 and 1997, and he held a range of executive roles. From 1999 to 2001, he was the advisor to the conservative shadow chancellor of the Exchequer. And yes, I had to look up how to pronounce Exchequer. He then works as head of communications in 2001 for Granada PLC, and he works on this merger between Carlton Communications to form ITV PLC in 2004. I have no idea if that's significant, just something that I thought I'd tuck away because it has to do with media. He joins the royal household as an assistant private secretary to the Queen in 2004, and then he's promoted to deputy private secretary in 2007. He becomes the private secretary in 2017 upon Lord Geit's retirement, but let's talk about that a little bit. Most of the articles at the time in September of 2017 linked to this Times UK article, which says Queen's aide Sir Christopher Geit ousted in palace power struggle. According to this article, it came amid differences over how to manage the transition of power between the Queen, who was 91 at the time, and her eldest son. Some were keen to accelerate the process, others were not. According to the Times UK, there have been tensions between Buckingham Palace and Clarence House for quite some time. Important to note, Sir Christopher Geit says that he was not forced out. It seems that the Duke of York might not have liked him because he forced him to step down in his trade ambassador role in 2011. Important to note that Edward Young was Geit's deputy director and then promoted to the private secretary position once he leaves, is ousted, whatever. But there are rumblings in early January 2020 that Edward is being called to be ousted. This doesn't pan out, but at the time they seem to think that because of Harry and Meghan's exit, that his head will be on the chopping block and he will be a casualty of this situation. According to this article, remember, allegedly, Geit was removed by Prince Charles and Prince Andrew after he expressed strong opinions and warnings about both Prince Andrew and the Sussexes, two situations that have come to pass. Take this with a massive grain of salt. According to a source, Edward Young was seen as weaker and easier to control than Geit. Sir Edward Young survived that unscathed, and he continued to work for the Queen until her death in September of 2022. And from everything I can find, he will not be a part of the redundancies that happen when a new sovereign takes over, and that he will continue working for King Charles. So that was just a little research into Sir Edward Young, but I feel like there is so much more there. Next, the Wasp. Finally, let's get into who the Wasp is from Prince Harry's book Spare. The Wasp refers to Prince Charles's private secretary, Clive Alderton. In the book, Harry writes this of the Wasp. The Wasp was lanky, charming, arrogant, a ball of jazzy energy. He was great at pretending to be polite, even servile. You'd assert a fact, something seemingly incontrovertible. I believe the sun rises in the mornings. And he'd stammer that, perchance, you might consider for a moment the possibility that you might be misinformed. Well, I don't know about that, Your Royal Highness. You see, it all depends on what you mean by mornings, sir. Because he seems so weedy, so self-effacing, you might be tempted to push back, insist on your point. And that was when he'd put you on his list. A short time later, without warning, he'd give you a stab with his outside stinger that you'd cry out in confusion. Where the fuck did that come from? So Clive Alderton has worked on and off for Camilla and Charles for years. He holds various jobs such as Deputy Private Secretary to Prince Charles and his wife starting in 2006. He is also promoted to the Private Secretary for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs to their Royal Highnesses in 2009 and 2012. He takes an appointment as ambassador to Morocco, etc. He's appointed Principal Private Secretary to Charles and Camilla on February 5th, 2015. This is from a September 2022 article from the Times UK. So according to this article, friends suggest that Clive is the one that provided Buckingham Palace with the now infamous wording, recollections may differ. A friend said, I just laughed and thought that's so Clive. It would be a perfect example of how he's very good with language. He's extremely articulate. He loves a debate and always wins an argument. Quote, he's one of the most, if not the most intelligent people I've ever met. He didn't go to university. He got fast-tracked into the Foreign Office. He broke a record and was Britain's youngest ambassador. He was the definition of a high flyer. I mean, it does sound like the kind of person you want in your corner, to be honest. This is also an interesting quote. Quote, I've seen him in many meetings around the table with officials, and they'll tell him what they want. He'll say, great, but at the end, they will have agreed to do what Charles wanted. Apparently, Meghan and Harry had a difficult time dealing with him when they were trying to negotiate a move to the U.S. So I think when you look at the Fly, the Bee, and the Wasp, and their personalities and their backgrounds, Harry didn't really stand a chance with this half-in, half-out scenario. I don't even believe it was ever, maybe even fully on the table for anyone, except maybe Harry and Meghan. But those are just my own personal opinions. So that is the Wasp. And I have previously covered the Bee and the Fly if you want to go back and watch them.